In the dark depths of the oceans of World War II, a revolutionary weapon forever silenced the fate of dozens of Allied ships. The Type 93 torpedo, later known as the Long Lance, represented much more than a simple evolution in naval technology. It constituted the perfect symbol of Japanese ingenuity applied to the art of submarine warfare. During the darkest years of the global conflict, this underwater projectile would completely redefine the rules of naval combat, setting parameters of range, speed, and destructive power that would remain unattainable by any other power for decades. The Imperial Japanese Navy's fascination with exceptionally large and powerful torpedoes dated back to the beginning of the 20th century, when naval armament was still in its earliest technological stages. As early as 1900, the Japanese had commissioned a monstrous torpedo of 27.5 inches in diameter, at a time when an 18-inch torpedo was considered a heavy weapon for large ships, and most world navies operated with significantly smaller armaments. This obsession with colossal dimensions was not a mere technological whim, but a calculated strategy to compensate for the numerical inferiority that would eternally characterize Japan's position in the oceans. During the 1900s and 1910s, slightly more conventional 24-inch diameter torpedoes were subsequently ordered, although the first models were whitehead torpedoes manufactured in Fiume. As with virtually all naval technology of the era, Japan desperately sought to bring this capability within its own technological and industrial domain. The first Japanese attempt to build a native torpedo was the 24-inch Year 8 torpedo, manufactured in 1919, representing a respectable effort by the standards of the time, with an approximate range of 11,000 yards, a maximum speed of 38 knots, and a relatively powerful 750-pound warhead. Simultaneously, they began work on a 21-inch diameter electric torpedo intended for use in their submarines, a project that started in the early 1920s. The fundamental reason for all this innovation lay in the devastating effects that torpedoes had demonstrated on various ships during several decades of conflicts, combined with the unquestionable knowledge that their main maritime rivals would certainly surpass them numerically in any future confrontation. This recognition had spurred the Japanese Navy to seek multiple ways to level the playing field, so to speak, and the torpedo emerged as one of their best hopes to achieve that goal. Not only would they intensify torpedo development in general, but they would also conduct the widest range of live-fire torpedo exercises during the interwar period, expending obsolete ships at a quite prodigious rate to determine the best way to attack a vessel with torpedoes. The Year 8 armament was succeeded in the late 1920s by the Type 90, which had a slightly larger warhead, a somewhat shorter range, but had increased its maximum speed to 46 knots. Now they would move to the next stage of development. Still in the 1910s, the Japanese Navy had briefly considered operating a torpedo with an oxygen-enriched fuel mixture. The advantages of more oxygen were obvious. Non-electric torpedoes needed to burn fuel to power their engines, and electric torpedoes simply did not have the power or speed necessary to go as far or as fast as the Japanese Navy required. Naturally, being submerged, a torpedo does not have access to open air, so the fuel will only burn as long as the oxygen inside the torpedo lasts. Most torpedoes solve this problem by supplying compressed air to the engine, but this presented some significant issues. Regular air contains only 21% oxygen, meaning that 79% of the compressed air was useless and would simply be vented as hot gas, along with any combustion products from the burning fuel. This would result in a bubble trail that completely gave away the torpedo's presence, and the limited amount of oxygen within the compressed air also restricted the torpedo's range. More oxygen would mean fewer bubbles, as there would be less exhaust gas. It would also mean more burn time due to the greater oxygen available for combustion with the fuel and a more complete and energetic combustion of the fuel. All these factors would allow a torpedo equipped with an oxygen-enriched mixture to travel farther, faster, and more stealthily. A Japanese officer, later promoted to the rank of admiral and with the surname Oyagi, spent some of the middle years of the 1920s at the Whitehead Torpedo Factory in England. There he heard about the large 24.5-inch diameter torpedoes being manufactured for the Nelson-class battleships. These weapons supposedly used pure oxygen along with their fuel, In reality, they used an oxygen-enriched air mixture, which provided some of the advantages of a pure oxygen mixture without many of the problems and risks associated with producing and storing 100% or nearly 100% pure oxygen. In any case, upon returning to Japan, Oyagi was assigned to the team that would produce the world's first production torpedo to run on a mixture of kerosene fuel and 100% pure oxygen. There were so many dangers the team needed to overcome. At the time, oxygen production relied on a cryogenic process that left everything around extremely cold and fragile. Consequently, accidents could and did happen. If high concentrations of oxygen escaped, they would discover the hard way that oxygen loves to react with anything its molecules can find. In the case of the torpedo, contact between the oxygen and the mechanism's lubricants could cause an immediate explosion, even if the lubricants were completely static and neutral in normal air. It was also discovered that if you simply dumped pure oxygen and kerosene into the combustion chamber, the torpedo would instantly travel at high speed in all directions at the same time, dismantling itself and anyone nearby with considerable enthusiasm, explaining that this was completely unacceptable behavior for a torpedo designed to destroy the Emperor's enemies. Really did not work very well, as they had not yet invented the spirit of the machine, and in any case, figuring out which part of the torpedo you should converse with or possibly scrape off the wall was difficult once it decided to launch a several hundred-meter search into the realm of the honorable ancestors. There was also the minor issue of the torpedo being somewhat dangerous if it was hit or damaged while still aboard the mothership in combat, assuming it did not decide to detonate for some random reason like an oxygen leak. The problem of the oxygen fuel mixture was finally solved by introducing a small bottle of compressed air. This would start the engine running in a slightly more conventional manner, and once the reaction and the engine were running smoothly, the feed would transition to the main oxygen tank. After much work, in the Japanese year 2593, the torpedo was ready and was thus nicknamed the Type 93 torpedo. In the Western world, this corresponded to the less futuristic year of 1933. To maintain secrecy even among most of the crews aboard the ships that would use it, the oxygen tank was simply labeled the secondary air tank, with the initial starting tank labeled as the first air tank. This, at least, was true. This combination meant that the engine would purr steadily at 520 horsepower, roughly the same power as a high-end sports sedan or some of the more common sports cars. This represented more than double the power of the British Nelson-class torpedoes and still more than 50% superior to that provided by other much newer weapons that other countries were developing. All this would provide the weapon with a maximum speed of 49 knots. This was relatively fast for a torpedo of the period, but not massively faster than some others. However, unlike those weapons that could sustain high speeds in the 40-knot range in short bursts, the Type 93, while still being somewhat faster than them, could continue moving forward for much greater distances. At maximum speed, the torpedo could travel for 22,000 yards, a distance that significantly exceeded the range of practically any naval gun of the time, except for the heaviest artillery pieces on battleships. By reducing the speed to 36 knots, still respectably fast, the range extended to an impressive 43,000 yards. To put this into perspective, most contemporary torpedoes had a maximum range between 6,000 and 15,000 yards, depending on the selected speed. The warhead was also substantially larger than most similar weapons of the time, carrying 1,080 pounds of explosive, more than enough to cause devastating damage to any ship unfortunate enough to encounter it. During the early years of World War II, the Allied powers remained completely unaware of the existence of this revolutionary weapon. In fact, naval intelligence had obtained information about a Type 93 torpedo in 1940, along with the changes in battle doctrine that the Japanese Navy had undertaken as a result of possessing it. That always helpful organization, the Ordnance Department, officially declared that the entire document had to be false and the weapon was completely impossible because neither the United States nor the United Kingdom, the department declared, had yet mastered such technology. And thus it was totally inconceivable that Japan had achieved this before them. One wonders how many Allied lives could have been spared if someone in power had taken that report seriously or told the department to shut up and let them read the report for themselves. As it was, the various Allied powers went to war under the belief that the Type 93 was a somewhat fast torpedo, but with a somewhat limited range compared to their own weapons. Thus, when the first naval battles broke out, Allied ships would constantly sail in a straight line to get a better firing solution, confident in being out of range of anything except enemy shells. This eliminated the only problem with the unguided Type 93's long range, specifically the need for the enemy not to change course, combined with the fact that most Japanese Navy ships carried reloads, as it was kept on the ships, and the Japanese cruisers and destroyers were happy to fire their torpedoes at around 20,000 yards and then start reloading, in case a second salvo at closer range was needed. As a result, during the series of short-lived battles that ended the Abda Command, the cruisers Java, De Ruyter, Exeter, Perth, and Houston, as well as the destroyer Courtenaire, were hit by Type 93s and, in most cases, sunk outright as a result. The large warhead had a devastating effect, capable of overcoming virtually any torpedo defense system it encountered on these small and medium-sized ships. With absolutely no idea what had happened, the Allies attributed the losses as being caused by mines, or even by Japanese submarines that had somehow cooperated with Japanese surface ships and had managed to approach unnoticed during the action. Ironically, a feat of coordination in fleet submarine work that the Japanese had desperately wanted to achieve, but in common with all navies since the development of the K-class and the German attempts to ambush the Grand Fleet emerging towards the Battle of Jutland, had actually completely failed to do and would continue failing for most of the war. As the war progressed, the Type 93 would continue to be responsible for or assist in the destruction of 6 more cruisers, 10 destroyers, and 1 aircraft carrier, the Hornet. Even in engagements where its enormous range was not particularly useful, the high-speed, lack-of-wake, and larger warhead still constituted a lethal combination. Although at the time, the Type 93 would become the central star of the most spectacular friendly fire incident of the war, when the cruiser Mogami fired a salvo of 6 Type 93s at the cruiser USS Houston, missed, but with their long range, the torpedoes happily continued on and exploded 4 friendly transports and 1 minesweeper. It really was not a good day. There were some other issues that were also appearing in the Japanese Navy's inventory. Both the torpedo itself and the way it was used were causing problems. The Type 93 required a small onboard oxygen plant to refuel the tanks and was also, naturally, loaded with pure oxygen. If the flask was damaged by enemy fire, even shrapnel from nearby shots or impacts on other parts of the ship, the best-case scenario was usually a spectacular fire. At worst, it could cause a massive and incapacitating explosion. This was, to be fair, mitigated to some degree by many Japanese torpedo tubes being equipped with a splinter shield to create a torpedo turret. But this would not save the launcher from a direct hit from a shell or bomb. The fact that Japanese Navy ships also tended to carry reloads meant that there were more torpedoes on board than most other ships would carry on average, which made such spectacular conflagrations a little more likely. Additionally, many launchers would try to make use of the maximum range that the torpedo was capable of, which was perfect if their enemies stayed obediently on course, but if they started maneuvering, this could completely ruin the surprise. During the destruction of the ABDA command fleet mentioned earlier, for example, despite those successful and decisive impacts for both sides, as it was later discovered, it took little more than 200 torpedoes to achieve 8 hits on enemy targets, in addition to the 5 hits on friendly ships. Conversely, when launched at more conventional ranges, stealth and speed tended to result in much higher hit rates. As was the case with most torpedoes in World War II, the Type 93 would also experience several teething problems in wartime conditions. Although it did not have a magnetic detonator and thus avoided many of the problems that plagued American, German, and British torpedoes that used this technology early in the war, it was found that the contact detonator was too sensitive and could be triggered by large waves and, in fact, ship wakes if it was set to run a little too shallow. A fact that likely saved the USS South Dakota and the USS Washington in the night battle of Guadalcanal, at least from damage if not destruction, as several torpedoes chasing them were seen exploding early upon encountering the pressure waves radiating from the fast-moving battleships. Although this was relatively easy to fix until it was done, it meant that several Allied warships remained intact during confrontations when this continued survival would prove highly detrimental to the interests of the Japanese Navy. Another problem was the size and inertia of the weapon. The guidance fins were a little too small for the task, meaning that when used at greater ranges, the torpedo tended to deviate slightly off course, although at those spectacularly long ranges, this slight dysfunction likely introduced a bit of randomness to the course that might have fractionally improved the chances of hitting the target, assuming the target had changed course or speed in any way during the time the torpedo was en route. Later in the war, the Type 93 would have two additional remodels. In one, the power plant was redesigned to operate without the compressed air tank, with a chemical injection regulator preventing starting explosions. This in turn allowed for a larger warhead to be installed, reaching an impressive more than 1,700 pounds of explosive. This Model 3 version was not ready for operational deployment before the end of the war, which was probably fortunate for all involved. The other modification was perhaps an even grimmer prospect. This one removed the nose and therefore the warhead of a standard Type 93, increased the control surfaces, and then inserted the remaining assembly into a much larger custom front section that had a small cockpit and a truly terrifying 3,400-pound warhead, along with small ballast tanks, sacrificing the original high speed for even greater range. This was the Chiton, a human-guided kamikaze version of the torpedo. However, due to control issues as well as having to get close enough to the surface to see where to go, these were not the most successful weapons, with only 2 confirmed kills and several ships damaged. Although 4 types of Chiton were designed, the unit derived from the Type 93 would be the only one to see operational service. The technical complexity of the Type 93 torpedo transcended any previous naval development, setting precedents that would profoundly influence naval strategic thinking for subsequent decades. The engineering behind this revolutionary weapon represented a quantum leap in underwater combat technology, incorporating innovations that challenged the limits of naval science at the time. The pure oxygen-based propulsion system not only provided superior performance, but also demonstrated how technological superiority could compensate for numerical disadvantages in naval conflicts. This lesson would resonate deeply during the Cold War years, when smaller powers would constantly seek methods to neutralize the naval supremacy of superpowers through asymmetric technological advances. The metallurgy required to safely contain pure oxygen under pressure demanded manufacturing techniques that pushed the Japanese industry to its absolute limits. Every internal component needed to be meticulously tested and calibrated to withstand the extreme conditions inside the combustion chamber, where temperatures and pressures reached levels that would rapidly destroy conventional materials. The development of special alloys capable of resisting the corrosion of pure oxygen, combined with the need for seals that maintained absolute integrity under severe operating conditions, required years of intensive research and costly experimentation. Production facilities had to be completely redesigned to accommodate the unique safety requirements associated with handling pure oxygen in industrial quantities. Specialized workers underwent extensive training on safety protocols, as a single error could result in catastrophic explosions that would destroy not only the torpedo in production, but potentially the entire facility. The oxygen fueling process required sophisticated cryogenic equipment, capable of producing, purifying, and compressing oxygen to operating pressures while maintaining near 100% purity. Any contamination, even microscopic traces of other gases or particles, could compromise the torpedo's performance or cause catastrophic failures during combat operations. The logistics of distributing these torpedoes to the fleet represented another monumental challenge, requiring specially modified ships with cryogenic storage systems and maintenance facilities capable of refueling the oxygen tanks in field conditions. Every ship equipped with the Type 93 needed to carry its own mini-oxygen plant, significantly increasing operational complexity and maintenance requirements. Crews received specialized training not only in handling the torpedoes, but also in operating the cryogenic support systems necessary to keep them functional. This reliance on complex technical infrastructure made Type 93-equipped ships particularly vulnerable to attacks that damaged their support systems, a vulnerability that would prove critical in prolonged combat. The Torpedo's guidance system, although sophisticated by the standards of the time, remained fundamentally limited by its unguided nature after launch. Once the Torpedo left the launch tube, it followed a pre-programmed trajectory based on interception calculations performed before firing. This limitation meant that maximum effectiveness crucially depended on the ability to accurately predict the target's movements during the torpedo's flight time, which could extend for several minutes in long-range shots. Japanese commanders developed elaborate tactics to maximize hit chances, including saturation fire using multiple torpedoes with slightly different trajectories to create a network of destruction through which the target would have difficulty escaping. The temporal coordination of these attacks required strict discipline and precise communication among attacking ships, especially in formations where multiple platforms contributed to a coordinated attack. The relatively long reloading time of the launchers meant that tactical decisions about when and how to employ the torpedoes had lasting consequences, as a wasted salvo could leave a ship temporarily defenseless against enemy counterattacks. The psychology of naval combat was permanently altered by the existence of the Type 93, even when Allied crews remained unaware of its true capabilities. The perception of safety at long distances, traditionally considered out of the range of torpedo attacks, gradually evaporated as reports of ships mysteriously sunk in seemingly impossible circumstances began to accumulate. Allied commanders faced a cruel tactical dilemma: maintain traditional combat distances that optimized their naval artillery but left them vulnerable to an invisible and incomprehensible threat, or approach to minimize the flight time of potential torpedoes, thus sacrificing advantages in the range of their main guns. This tactical uncertainty forced significant doctrinal changes in Allied navies, even when the exact nature of the threat remained poorly understood. Ships began adopting more erratic maneuver patterns, sacrificing firing accuracy for movement unpredictability, in an attempt to frustrate possible long-range torpedo attacks. Confidence in Western technological superiority, a fundamental pillar of Allied naval strategy, suffered substantial shocks as evidence accumulated that Japan had somehow achieved capabilities that exceeded those of the world's most advanced navies. This erosion of technological confidence would have lasting repercussions on naval strategic thinking, influencing approaches to armament development throughout the Cold War period. The eventual revelation of the Type 93's true capabilities would force a fundamental reassessment of assumptions about technological supremacy, demonstrating that seemingly secondary powers could achieve revolutionary advances through innovative and unconventional approaches. This lesson would profoundly shape the attitudes of the superpowers towards armament development during the following decades, leading to massive investments in research and development to prevent potential adversaries from achieving similar technological advantages. The influence of the Type 93 on the evolution of naval doctrine extended far beyond its active operational period, establishing principles that would remain relevant during the era of Cold War anti-ship missiles. The concept of using long-range weapons to deny access to specific maritime zones, demonstrated so effectively by the Japanese torpedo, would become central to defensive naval strategies developed by smaller powers during the bipolar period. The Soviet Union, in particular, would intensively study Japanese sea denial tactics when developing its own anti-naval capabilities, incorporating lessons learned from the employment of the Type 93 into its coastal defense doctrines. The ability to inflict disproportionate losses through technologically superior weapons, even when facing numerically superior forces, became a recurring theme in strategic planning during the Cold War. Smaller navies would seek to replicate the Japanese success through the development of asymmetric capabilities that could effectively threaten larger conventional fleets, a pursuit that would lead to the development of fast attack submarines, long-range anti-ship missiles, and eventually nuclear underwater weapons. The legacy of the Type 93 in shaping modern naval strategic thinking remains visible in contemporary doctrines of access denial and area projection, where smaller but technologically advanced forces seek to neutralize numerical advantages through specialized high-performance capabilities. The fundamental lesson demonstrated by the Japanese torpedo, that concentrated technological superiority can overcome numerical disadvantages in specific domains, would continue to influence armament development and strategic planning decades after the end of World War II, fundamentally shaping the nature of naval conflict during the nuclear era. The post-war analysis of the Type 93's capabilities would reveal technical aspects that would completely transform Western understanding of Japanese naval engineering, forcing a radical reassessment of assumptions about technological supremacy that had dominated military thinking for decades. When American and British expert teams were finally able to examine captured specimens and recovered technical documentation, the sophistication of the design made it clear that Japan had achieved fundamental advances in multiple technological areas simultaneously. The advanced metallurgy required for pure oxygen-resistant components, the precise combustion control systems required for stable operation, and the propulsion engineering that maximized energy efficiency represented technological leaps that the Western powers had drastically underestimated. This revelation would catalyze profound changes in technical intelligence approaches during the initial Cold War period, where underestimating adversary capabilities could have catastrophic strategic consequences. The technical report prepared by U.S. Navy personnel after detailed examination of the remaining torpedoes would constitute fundamental reading for generations of naval engineers, establishing new parameters for the development of underwater armaments. Many of the innovations pioneered in the Type 93 would directly fuel the development of future torpedoes that would serve the Allied forces during the Cold War period, demonstrating how technological advances by adversaries could be assimilated and improved upon by victorious powers. The transition from pure oxygen to even more advanced propulsion systems, eventually including nuclear propulsion for torpedoes, would follow technical trajectories established by the Japanese pioneers decades earlier. The concept of maximizing range and speed through innovative propulsion systems would become central to the development of underwater armaments throughout the bipolar era, where second-line capabilities could determine critical strategic advantages. The employment doctrine of the Type 93 would anticipate many elements of the access denial strategies that would become central to Cold War naval confrontations, particularly in the context of asymmetric conflicts where smaller forces faced numerically superior adversaries. The Japanese tactic of using long-range torpedoes to establish sea zones, denied to the enemy, would resonate deeply in Soviet naval doctrines, which would seek methods to neutralize American naval supremacy through specialized high-performance capabilities. Fast attack submarines equipped with long-range torpedoes became central components of Soviet naval strategy, applying principles of asymmetric employment demonstrated so effectively by Japanese ships decades earlier. The ability to inflict disproportionate losses through technologically superior weapons, regardless of numerical disadvantages, would profoundly influence the development of anti-naval capabilities throughout the bipolar period. Long-range anti-ship missiles, torpedoes with advanced terminal guidance, and eventually nuclear underwater weapon systems would follow conceptual trajectories established by the pioneering employment of the Type 93 in sea denial operations. The psychology of naval combat, altered by the existence of invisible long-range threats, would fundamentally shape tactical approaches during Cold War confrontations, where uncertainty about adversary capabilities would force conservative but costly doctrinal changes. American fleets operating in potentially hostile waters would adopt movement patterns and defensive formations directly influenced by lessons learned about vulnerabilities revealed by the Japanese employment of exceptionally performing torpedoes. The psychological impact of the Type 93 on Allied naval planners would transcend its specific technical capabilities, establishing precedents for threat assessment during a period of intense technological competition characteristic of the Cold War. The experience of facing an underwater threat, whose true capabilities remained poorly understood for years of active conflict, demonstrated the critical importance of accurate technical intelligence about adversary capabilities. This recognition would lead to massive investments in scientific intelligence programs during the 1940s and 1950s, where Western powers would seek to avoid repeating the errors of underestimation that had cost so many naval lives during the Pacific confrontations. The technical analysis methodology, developed to retrospectively understand the Type 93's capabilities, would establish models for evaluating technological threats that would remain relevant during the development of nuclear weapon systems, ballistic missiles, and eventually space technology during the following decades. The lesson that apparently less advanced adversaries could achieve revolutionary breakthroughs through unconventional approaches would permanently shape strategic planning attitudes, leading to preventive investments in research and development aimed at maintaining technological advantages against future surprises. The principle that localized technological superiority could overcome greater systemic disadvantages would influence resource allocation approaches throughout the Cold War, where smaller powers would seek niches of technological excellence capable of neutralizing conventional advantages of superpowers. The evolution of torpedo technology after 1945 would follow trajectories established by Japanese innovations, with the development of terminal guidance systems, advanced propulsion, and high-efficiency warheads building upon technical foundations demonstrated by the Type 93. Sonar-guided torpedoes developed during the 1950s and 1960s would incorporate lessons about maximizing range and speed learned through analysis of captured Japanese specimens. The eventual transition to nuclear propulsion in strategic torpedoes would follow energy optimization principles, pioneered by the engineers who developed the pure oxygen combustion systems decades earlier. Cold War-era underwater weapon systems, including nuclear torpedoes like the Soviet T-15 and similar American designs, would demonstrate direct influence of asymmetric employment concepts validated by the operational success of the Type 93 during the Pacific campaigns. The doctrine of using exceptional capacity underwater armaments to deny sea access to superior conventional forces would become central to the defensive naval strategies of smaller powers throughout the bipolar period. Smaller navies would seek to replicate asymmetric advantages demonstrated by the Japanese employment of superior torpedoes, leading to the development of specialized submarines, coastal missile systems, and eventually area denial capabilities based on nuclear technology. The conceptual legacy of the Type 93 would remain visible in contemporary naval doctrines, where technologically advanced but numerically limited forces seek to neutralize conventional advantages through specialized high-performance capabilities, perpetuating strategies established by Japanese innovators during the previous world conflict. The operational reality of the Type 93's employment in combat conditions would reveal tactical complexities that transcended its impressive technical specifications, demonstrating how revolutionary weapons require equally innovative doctrines to maximize their strategic effectiveness. Japanese commanders would quickly discover that the mere possession of superior technology did not automatically guarantee tactical success, as the effective employment of this exceptional weapon demanded precise coordination, perfect timing, and a deep understanding of the inherent limitations of any unguided weapon system. Early combat operations would demonstrate that long-range shots, although impressive in terms of technical capability, often resulted in disappointing hit rates when enemy targets maintained unrestricted maneuver freedom. The fixed trajectory of the torpedo after launch meant that accuracy crucially depended on the ability to predict enemy movements over prolonged periods, a task that would prove extraordinarily challenging in dynamic combat conditions where adversary commanders reacted tactically to perceived threats. Spectacular successes in engagements such as the destruction of the Abda Force primarily resulted from specific tactical circumstances where Allied ships maintained predictable courses for periods long enough to allow interception by long-range torpedoes. This dependence on favorable tactical conditions would force Japanese commanders to develop methods to create or exploit situations where the enemy would be compelled to maintain relatively stable courses, including diversionary tactics, coordinated attacks from multiple directions, and the employment of complementary threats that would limit enemy maneuver options. The need for coordination among multiple attacking platforms would require precise communication and rigorous timing, capabilities that were not always available in real operational conditions where radio interference, battle damage, or simply combat confusion could compromise perfect tactical execution. The operational logistics associated with the employment of Type 93 torpedoes would introduce significant strategic vulnerabilities that would partially balance their tactical advantages, demonstrating how technologically advanced weapons often require proportionally complex support infrastructure. Every ship equipped with these torpedoes became dependent on specialized oxygen refueling facilities, limiting operational flexibility and creating single points of failure that adversaries could exploit through attacks directed at logistical infrastructure. The need to maintain functional cryogenic plants on board significantly increased maintenance and specialized training requirements, reducing the operational availability of ships and requiring highly qualified technical personnel who often could not be easily replaced after combat losses. Accidents with pure oxygen systems, although relatively rare, would occasionally result in catastrophic losses that eliminated entire ships without any direct enemy involvement, an operational risk that commanders would constantly need to balance against the tactical advantages offered by the weapon. The particular vulnerability of pure oxygen-loaded torpedoes to damage caused by enemy fire would create tactical dilemmas where ships armed with the Type 93 would face disproportionate risks when exposed to artillery bombardment, limiting their usefulness in prolonged engagements where damage absorption would be inevitable. Commanders would develop specific tactics to minimize exposure to counterattacks after torpedo launch, including rapid retreats and the use of smoke screens, demonstrating how specific armament characteristics fundamentally influence the tactical approaches of the units that employ them. Operational experience with the Type 93 would demonstrate fundamental principles about the employment of asymmetric weapons that would remain relevant during the Cold War period, where smaller powers would constantly seek methods to neutralize the conventional advantages of more powerful adversaries. The disproportionate success achieved during the initial phases of the Pacific conflict primarily resulted from factors that transcended the mere technical capabilities of the torpedo, including strategic surprise, superior doctrinal preparation, and exploitation of specific vulnerabilities in Allied naval tactics. As Allied forces adapted their tactical approaches to mitigate the threats posed by the Type 93, including more erratic movement patterns, modified defensive formations, and eventually the development of specific technical countermeasures, the relative effectiveness of the Japanese weapon would decrease correspondingly. This dynamic of action and tactical reaction demonstrated that technological advantages, however revolutionary they may be initially, tend to erode as adversaries develop specific adaptations to neutralize superior capabilities. The limited time during which any specific weapon maintains a decisive advantage over competent adversaries would force strategic planners to consider not only the technical capabilities of weapon systems, but also the sustainability of the advantages they provide over prolonged conflicts. Lessons about the need for continuous evolution and the development of successive capabilities to maintain technological advantages would profoundly influence research and development approaches during the Cold War period, where the arms race would require constant innovation to prevent adversaries from achieving parity or superiority in specific domains. The comparative analysis between the theoretical performance and the actual operational results of the Type 93 would reveal significant discrepancies that would illustrate the inherent limitations of any weapon system, regardless of how impressive its isolated technical specifications may be. While controlled tests demonstrated exceptional capabilities in range, speed, and destructive power, real combat conditions would introduce variables that often prevented the full realization of the weapon's theoretical potential. Environmental factors such as adverse weather conditions, sea state, limited visibility, and electronic interference would significantly affect accuracy and operational reliability, demonstrating the importance of testing weapon systems under conditions that faithfully replicated real operational environments. The need to make quick tactical decisions under combat pressure often prevented commanders from fully exploiting the torpedo's long-range capabilities, forcing employment at suboptimal distances where technical advantages were partially wasted. Human limitations in estimating enemy courses, speeds, and tactical intentions would introduce systematic errors that would reduce operational effectiveness regardless of the technical precision of the launch and guidance systems. The complexity of coordinating multi-platform attacks necessary to maximize hit probabilities would create opportunities for communication failures, timing errors, and tactical conflicts that would compromise the execution of theoretically perfect operational plans. These operational experiences would demonstrate that effective armament development must consider not only isolated technical performance, but also systemic integration with human capabilities, logistical limitations, and the tactical realities of complex combat environments. The recognition that even revolutionary weapons operate within broader systems that include human, organizational, and environmental factors would influence armament development approaches in subsequent decades, where systemic integration became as important as specific technical advances in determining real operational effectiveness. The transition from the period of active war to post-conflict analysis would reveal aspects of the Type 93 program that would transcend its immediate military importance, establishing precedents for technological development that would profoundly influence armament research approaches during the Cold War era. The technical documentation recovered from Japanese facilities would demonstrate levels of sophistication in systems engineering that would force a fundamental reassessment of Japanese industrial capabilities, revealing a research and development infrastructure that had remained largely invisible to Allied intelligence during years of conflict. Specialized production facilities, advanced testing equipment, and quality control methodologies discovered by post-war investigators would indicate that Japan had developed precision manufacturing capabilities that rivaled or exceeded those of Western industrial powers in specific domains. This revelation would catalyze significant changes in technical intelligence approaches during the initial Cold War period, where underestimating adversary capabilities could have catastrophic strategic consequences in an era of nuclear armaments and advanced missile technology. The reverse engineering methodology, applied to understand the technical principles of the Type 93, would establish models for the analysis of adversary weapon systems that would remain relevant during decades of bipolar technological competition, where the ability to understand and quickly respond to enemy innovations would determine critical strategic advantages. Research programs initiated to incorporate lessons learned from the Japanese torpedo would directly fuel the development of underwater armaments during the Cold War period, including nuclear torpedoes, advanced guidance systems, and eventually submarine-launched anti-ship missiles that would define modern naval warfare. The conceptual influence of the Type 93 on the development of naval doctrines during the Cold War would manifest itself through multiple trajectories that would connect Japanese technical innovations with bipolar confrontation strategies decades later. The Soviet Union, facing a numerical naval disadvantage similar to the one that had motivated the Japanese development of asymmetric capabilities, would adopt conceptual approaches directly inspired by the operational success of the Long-Lance torpedo during the initial Pacific campaigns. Soviet nuclear submarines armed with long-range torpedoes would represent a direct evolution of principles established by the Japanese employment of superior underwater weapons against numerically dominant conventional fleets. Soviet sea denial doctrine through specialized capabilities would follow tactical trajectories pioneered by Japanese commanders who had demonstrated the effectiveness of asymmetric employment against forces superior in numbers but vulnerable to specific technologies. The development of anti-ship missiles like the P-15 Termit family and subsequent more advanced systems would incorporate lessons about maximizing range and destructive power learned through detailed study of preceding Japanese capabilities. The strategy of establishing denied sea zones through invisible long-range threats, validated by the initial success of the Type 93, would become central to Soviet defensive approaches throughout the Cold War. American naval forces responded by developing specific countermeasures and defensive tactics aimed at operating effectively in environments where exceptional performance underwater threats could deny traditional access to contested waters, perpetuating cycles of action and technological reaction established during the Pacific conflict. The technological evolution of torpedoes during the Cold War period would demonstrate direct and continued influence of innovations pioneered in the Type 93 program, with multiple generations of underwater armaments building upon technical foundations established by Japanese engineers decades earlier. Advanced propulsion systems developed for American and Soviet torpedoes during the 1950s and 1960s would incorporate energy optimization principles, demonstrated by the employment of pure oxygen, albeit using safer and more reliable technologies such as nuclear propulsion or less volatile chemical systems. Torpedoes like the American Mark 48 and the Soviet Set 65 would demonstrate clear influence of performance specifications established by the Type 93, including combinations of high speed, long range, and powerful warheads that had defined capacity standards during the previous world conflict. The development of active terminal guidance systems would represent a natural evolution of limitations identified in the Japanese torpedo, where accuracy at long distances had been compromised by the absence of course correction capability after launch. Sonar-guided torpedoes developed during the Cold War period would address fundamental deficiencies of the Type 93 while preserving its advantages in speed and destructive power. The eventual transition to nuclear underwater armaments would follow conceptual trajectories established by the asymmetric employment of superior torpedoes, where individual weapons of exceptional capacity could threaten strategically valuable targets regardless of adversary conventional superiority. Projects like the Soviet nuclear torpedo T-15 and similar American concepts would represent the logical culmination of principles initiated by the development of the Type 93, where maximization of individual destructive power would replace reliance on volume of fire to achieve decisive strategic effects. The armament development methodology demonstrated by the Type 93 program would establish models for research and development during the Cold War that would transcend the specific naval domain, influencing approaches to military technological innovation in multiple capability domains. The Japanese willingness to accept significant technical risks in pursuit of revolutionary operational advantages would inspire advanced research programs on both sides of the bipolar divide, where the potential for decisive breakthroughs would justify investments in high-uncertainty experimental technologies. Organizations like the American Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and equivalent Soviet institutes would adopt research philosophies that emphasize the pursuit of transformative capabilities instead of incremental improvements, reflecting lessons about the value of radical innovation demonstrated by the success of the Japanese torpedo. The integration of multiple technical disciplines necessary for the development of the Type 93, including advanced chemistry, specialized metallurgy, precision engineering, and fluid dynamics, would establish precedents for the interdisciplinary approaches that would characterize armament projects during the Cold War. Programs like the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, inertial guidance systems, and eventually space technology would follow organizational models established by teams that had overcome extraordinary technical challenges to produce armaments of unprecedented capacity. The culture of aggressive technical innovation that had allowed Japan to achieve temporary but decisive advantages through superior armaments would influence military development approaches for subsequent decades, where the arms race would demand a constant willingness to explore technological frontiers regardless of associated risks or costs. The legacy of the Type 93 in shaping mindsets about armament development would remain visible in subsequent projects where the pursuit of decisive technological superiority would justify massive investments in frontier research, perpetuating cycles of military innovation that would define strategic competition during the nuclear era. The historical perspective reveals that the Type 93 long-lance torpedo represented much more than a single isolated technical innovation, constituting instead a fundamental catalyst for lasting transformations in the nature of modern naval warfare and in the strategic relations between powers during the second half of the 20th century. Its influence broadly transcended its specific operational period, establishing conceptual and technical precedents that would continue to shape armament development, naval doctrines, and military intelligence approaches during decades of bipolar confrontation that characterized the Cold War. The demonstrated ability of a seemingly secondary power to achieve decisive technological advantages through innovative and unconventional approaches, would force a permanent reassessment of assumptions about technical supremacy and industrial superiority that had underpinned the military strategies of the great powers for preceding generations. This lesson about the vulnerability of established hegemonies to asymmetric innovations would profoundly influence strategic mindsets during the Cold War period, where both the United States and the Soviet Union would invest enormously in research programs aimed at preventing adversaries from achieving technological advantages similar to those demonstrated by the Japanese torpedo decades earlier. The recognition that smaller powers could develop specialized capabilities capable of neutralizing the conventional advantages of superpowers would establish paradigms of military competition that would remain relevant throughout the nuclear era, where the proliferation of advanced technologies would allow smaller strategic actors to effectively challenge established hierarchies through specific high-performance capabilities. The technical analysis methodology developed to retrospectively understand the Type 93's capabilities would establish models for evaluating technological threats that would remain essential during the period of rapid evolution of weapon systems, where intelligence failures about adversary capabilities could have catastrophic strategic consequences in an era of nuclear armaments and intercontinental delivery systems. The lasting influence of the Type 93 program on military technological development approaches would manifest itself through multiple dimensions that would connect Japanese innovations of the 1930s with the armament programs of the superpowers in subsequent decades, demonstrating conceptual continuities that would transcend fundamental changes in specific technologies and geopolitical contexts. Principles of performance maximization, through the acceptance of calculated technical risks, validated by the operational success of the Japanese torpedo, would inspire advanced research programs during the Cold War, where the pursuit of transformative capabilities would justify investments in experimental technologies of high uncertainty and revolutionary potential. Organizations like the American Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency would explicitly incorporate lessons about the value of radical innovation learned through the study of the Japanese development of asymmetric capabilities, emphasizing high-risk, high-return projects aimed at achieving decisive technological advantages before adversaries could effectively respond. The Soviet willingness to invest massive resources in the development of nuclear submarines armed with exceptionally performing torpedoes would directly reflect the influence of principles established by the successful employment of the Type 93 against superior conventional forces, demonstrating how operational lessons from preceding conflicts would continue to shape military strategies during completely transformed technological contexts. The development of anti-ship missiles, electronic warfare systems, and eventually cyber capabilities would follow conceptual trajectories established by the Japanese demonstration that localized technological superiority could overcome systemic disadvantages through the intelligent employment of specialized capabilities. The evolution of access denial and area projection doctrines during the Cold War period would build directly upon tactical foundations established by Japanese commanders who had pioneered the employment of long-range weapons to establish sea zones denied to conventional adversary forces. The psychological dimension of the Type 93's impact on naval strategic planning would reveal fundamental aspects about the nature of military competition during the Cold War that would transcend the specific technical capabilities of individual weapon systems, demonstrating how perceptions about vulnerabilities and threats shaped strategic decisions regardless of objective operational realities. The traumatic experience of facing an underwater threat whose true capabilities remained poorly understood for years of active conflict would establish precedents for conservative threat assessment that would influence military planning approaches in subsequent decades, where uncertainty about adversary capabilities would force massive defensive investments aimed at protecting against potential rather than confirmed threats. This worst-case scenario planning mentality, catalyzed by the experience with the Japanese torpedo, would contribute significantly to the dynamics of the arms race during the Cold War, where both superpowers would develop capabilities aimed at neutralizing perceived threats that often exceeded adversary operational realities. The transformation of Allied naval tactics in response to the threat posed by the Type 93 including the adoption of more complex movement patterns, modified defensive formations, and eventually the development of specific technical countermeasures, would demonstrate principles of tactical adaptation that would remain central to military confrontations during the bipolar period. American fleets operating in potentially contested waters during Cold War crises would adopt operational procedures directly influenced by lessons learned about vulnerabilities revealed by the Japanese employment of exceptionally performing underwater armaments, perpetuating the operational influence of technical innovations decades after the conclusion of conflicts where they had been initially employed. The retrospective examination of the development, employment and legacy of the Type 93 long-lance torpedo offers fundamental perspectives on the dynamics of military innovation, technological competition, and strategic evolution that remain relevant for understanding contemporary confrontations, where emerging powers seek to challenge established hegemonies through specialized asymmetric capabilities. The Japanese demonstration that concentrated investments in specific technological domains could produce disproportionate operational advantages, established models for armament development that continue to influence modern military strategies, where limited resources must be applied efficiently to maximize capabilities in areas of greatest strategic impact. The Japanese torpedo's ability to fundamentally alter naval combat dynamics through superior performance in specific characteristics illustrates principles about the nature of military superiority that transcend particular technological contexts, demonstrating how revolutionary innovations in individual capabilities can produce strategic effects that widely exceed the investments necessary to develop them. The historical experience with the Type 93 validates military development approaches that emphasize the pursuit of qualitative advantages instead of quantitative superiority, a lesson that remains central for powers facing resource disadvantages but possessing advanced technological capabilities. The lasting legacy of this extraordinary weapon lies not only in its impressive technical specifications or specific operational successes, but mainly in its demonstration that determination, innovation, and the intelligent employment of superior technology can fundamentally alter strategic balances, regardless of conventional disparities in overall military power. The lessons of the Type 93 long-lance torpedo continue to echo through decades of subsequent military development, reminding strategic planners that underestimating adversary capabilities or presuming permanent technological superiority constitute errors that can have lasting historical consequences. In contexts where military innovation determines the destinies of nations and the frameworks of the international order.